Previously in Building 47, Ethan Cole moved into an apartment that didn't exist in any city records. He thought it was an administrative error. Until one night, he heard the elevator moving, when no one had called it. Tonight, we continue his story. The night he decided to find out where that elevator really goes. It always started at the same time, 3:11 a.m., a time when the world is supposed to be at its quietest, when the veil between the waking and the dreaming is at its thinnest. For Ethan, it was an alarm clock he never set, a nightly appointment he was forced to keep. The silence of his apartment would suddenly feel heavy, charged with a dreadful anticipation. He'd lie in bed, eyes wide open in the dark, listening. Not for a burglar, not for the wind, but for the building itself to stir from its slumber. And then it would come. A low, groaning hum that vibrated through the concrete bones of Building 47. Ethan would hear the distant strain of the elevator cables, a sound like a tired beast being roused from a deep, unwilling sleep. It was followed by the mechanical thud of doors opening on a floor no one lived on. The 7th floor, always the 7th, a place long since abandoned, its apartments hollowed out and silent. He imagined the empty car waiting there in the darkness, its doors gaping open, inviting nothing. Most nights he'd ignore it, pulling the covers tighter, a useless shield against a sound that felt like it was inside his own head. But curiosity is a persistent, gnawing thing. On nights like this, he'd creep to his peephole, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He'd watch the floor indicator across the hall. He'd seen it do strange things before. Sometimes, it would flash a symbol instead of a number, a jagged, unfamiliar glyph that seemed to burn itself onto his retina before vanishing. He tried to draw it once, but his hand would shake, the memory already twisting, refusing to be captured. It felt ancient, wrong, a character from a language that should have never been spoken. That night, the display glitched again, a chaotic dance of red light. Then, for a split second that stretched into an eternity, it showed something impossible. Something that broke the rules of the building, the rules of reality itself. It showed 1. A -1. A sublevel. A basement. The number glowed with a malevolent stillness, a stark, undeniable fact in the flickering light of the hallway. The hum from the elevator shaft deepened, changing pitch. It was no longer just moving, it was descending, going down. There were no basements in Building 47. Ethan knew this for a fact. He'd seen the blueprints when he moved in, a faded, curling document that showed nothing but solid foundation beneath the ground floor. It was a concrete slab, end of story. At least, there weren't supposed to be. The glowing red digit on the panel across the hall begged to differ. It was a silent, screaming contradiction to everything he knew. The elevator was going somewhere that didn't exist. Determined to capture proof, Ethan started recording. The elevator opened before he even pressed the button. Inside, the air was colder, metallic, heavy, like being underground. He stepped in. The moment the doors closed, the display flickered violently. Ground floor, basement, 1, and then nothing, just static lines on the panel.
Unintelligible whispers.
He tried pressing open. The button didn't respond. The descent was unsettling. The elevator, usually a smooth and silent servant of the building, had begun to shudder violently after passing the ground floor. The digital display, which should have stopped at B for basement, flickered erratically. Numbers flashed in a chaotic sequence before settling on a stark, impossible figure, -1, a floor that wasn't on any blueprint, a level that officially did not exist. A low hum replaced the usual gentle music, vibrating through the soles of Ethan's shoes. He felt a cold dread bloom in his chest, a primal warning that he was going somewhere he wasn't meant to be. The air grew thick and stale, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else. Something metallic and old. When the doors finally ground open, it wasn't to the familiar, sterile basement. Ethan found himself on a floor that shouldn't exist. He stood frozen at the threshold, the relatively safe, clean box of the elevator behind him, and this forgotten world before him. The air that washed over him was heavy and cold, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled building he knew. It was a place sealed off from time, left to fester in the dark underbelly of the city. The walls were weeping, covered in a sheen of moisture that reflected the flickering, unreliable light. Scrawled across the damp concrete were strange symbols, crude circles intersected by jagged, angry lines. They were drawn in something that looked like rust, but the color was too deep, too dark. It was as if the building itself had bled onto the walls, leaving behind cryptic wounds. Old furniture, rotting desks, overturned chairs, and filing cabinets with their drawers hanging open like mouths lay piled against the walls in chaotic mounds. Everything looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry, left to the mercy of decay for decades. And then he heard it. Faint at first, but growing steadily more distinct. From the oppressive darkness at the far end of the hall, something metallic scraped rhythmically against the concrete floor. A heavy, dragging sound. His heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to let the elevator doors close, to go back up. But a morbid curiosity, a need to understand, rooted him to the spot. With a trembling hand, he raised his phone, the camera's light cutting a nervous, dancing beam into the corridor. He had to document this. No one would ever believe him otherwise. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding small and thin in the vast, damp space. The scraping stopped. The sudden, absolute silence was somehow more terrifying than the noise it replaced. It was a listening silence. A waiting silence. It wasn't a simple echo. The word came back to him warped, drawn out and layered with a faint, sibilant whisper, as if spoken by something trying to imitate a human voice. It was a mocking reply from the darkness. Behind him, with a soft, final chime, the elevator doors began to close, sealing him in. He'd been drawn to this floor by whispers online, tales of a place that didn't exist on any official blueprint. Floor 1. A ghost in the machine of Building 47. For an hour, Ethan had found nothing but empty, sterile corridors, the kind that hum with the quiet drone of forgotten machinery. He was about to call it a bust, another urban legend leading to a dead end. But then, he felt it. A sudden, sharp drop in temperature, so abrupt it felt like stepping through a curtain of ice. The air grew heavy, thick with a pressure that pushed in on his eardrums. Behind him, a sound he hadn't realized had stopped, started again. The sound of the elevator doors he'd just exited began closing. Slowly at first. A reluctant, grinding complaint of metal on metal. Then, with a sudden, violent surge of motion, they slammed shut with a deafening boom that echoed down the hall. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He turned and ran, his footsteps slapping against the linoleum, a frantic, desperate rhythm in the sudden silence. His mind screamed, a primal instinct to escape the unseen thing that had just announced its presence. He reached out, his fingers just inches from the cold steel of the doors. A final, desperate lunge for the world he was about to lose. But just as his fingertips were about to make contact, the flickering overhead lights gave a final pathetic buzz and died. Total darkness. Not just the absence of light, but a thick, suffocating blackness that felt like a physical weight. It swallowed all sound, all sense of direction. Ethan's own ragged breaths were loud in his ears, the frantic thumping of his heart a drumbeat against his ribs. He froze, every muscle tensed, straining to hear, to see, to feel anything beyond the crushing void. The silence stretched, taut and menacing, and then it broke. It was a sound that didn't belong, a slow, wet, labored breathing, like air being forced through fluid. It wasn't his, it was too close, yet seemed to come from everywhere at once. It echoed in the dark, a chilling counterpoint to his own frantic pulse. He held his breath, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound was inside his head, around him, a part of the darkness itself.
You thought this was the bottom. There is no bottom.
A voice, a dry, sibilant whisper, slithered directly into his ear, a promise of infinite descent. Terror gave way to action. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers clumsy and slick with sweat. The flashlight flickered on, a pathetic, struggling beam that cut a weak cone through the oppressive dark. But this wasn't the corridor he had just run down. The clean white walls were gone, replaced by weeping, ancient brick that glistened with a foul-smelling slime. He swept the light back toward the sound of the slam, and his blood ran cold. There were the elevator doors, but they were wrong. Impossibly old, covered in a century of rust and decay. And there, etched into the corroded metal, was the same symbol he'd been searching for: Ion. The doors slid open with a low groan, not of machinery, but of something ancient and tired. There was no choice. Behind him was the breathing darkness. In front, this cage of rust and wires offered the only path. He stepped inside, the floor groaning under his weight. The interior was no better. The walls were a tapestry of scratches, names, and dates gouged into the metal. The doors closed, sealing him in, and with a lurch that threw him against the wall, the elevator began to move. Not up. Down. He looked at the control panel, hoping for some clue, some logic, but the display was a cascade of madness. It glitched between symbols he didn't recognize and words that didn't make sense. What looked like geographic coordinates, dates from the distant past and impossible future, maybe names, flashing and dying in a schizophrenic dance of light. The descent grew faster, the hum of the elevator replaced by a high-pitched whine that vibrated through the floor, through his bones. The chaos on the screen stopped. For one final terrible second, the display steadied, the glitching symbols resolving into a single, stark word, burning itself onto his retinas. A destination, a declaration, a damnation. The last thing it showed was a single word: below. The elevator never stopped. No one saw Ethan Cole again, and Building 47 remains off the city grid.